The world was made of grit. It was in the air, in the water, and in the bread. It settled in the folds of your skin and under your fingernails. For Lila, chained in the back of the transport wagon, the grit was all she had left to feel. The wagon bed, raw wood and splintered, had rubbed her hips raw. The chains on her wrists and ankles were heavy iron, forged by a man who had never worn them. And they had a cold, dead weight that went right into the bone. She was one of 6, 2 men, 3 other women. They were heading west, toward the edge of New Mexico territory, or maybe beyond. The men driving the wagon didn't talk to their cargo. They talked over them, about prices, about the trouble with the Comanches, about the heat. They were cruel in the way that only men who believe they are moving furniture can be. They had hard, sun-scorched faces and rifles that lay easy across their laps. Lila kept her head down, like she was supposed to. She had learned long ago that silence was a shield. They mistook it for emptiness, for a broken spirit. They were wrong. Beneath the veil of quiet, she watched. She watched the way the sun moved across the sky, marking the time. She watched the guards, how one was lazy and drank from a flask, and how the other was watchful and spat tobacco. She listened to the creak of the axle, waiting for the sound of it splitting. She observed everything, because information was the only coin she had. The others in the wagon had given in. Their eyes were dull. The high desert had baked the hope right out of them. The land itself was a promise of death. Red rock formations rose up like broken teeth against a pale, bleached sky. There was no water, no shade, just the endless rattle and jolt of the wagon, and the sun, a merciless white eye that burned away everything but the hard, dry truth. Lila held on to her own truth. She was not furniture. She was not a name in a ledger. She was Lila, and she would not be broken. The attack came with a suddenness that stole the breath. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a crack of gunfire from the rocks above, and the lazy guard slumped over the side of the wagon, his flask spinning away in the dust. "Ambush!" the watchful guard yelled, pulling his rifle and firing blindly into the canyon. More shots answered. Bullets punched through the wooden sides of the wagon. One of the women screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short. The wagon lurched to a stop, throwing them all into a heap of chains and limbs. "It's a supply run!" a voice yelled from the rocks. "Take the mules!" The bandits, it seemed, had made a mistake. They thought they were hitting a freighter full of whiskey or rifles. They were not expecting human cargo. The watchful guard was down now, trying to crawl under the wagon, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The bandits, 3 of them, spurred their horses down the rocky incline, whooping and firing. This was chaos. This was the crack in the world Lila had been waiting for. The bandits yanked open the back gate, their faces covered in bandanas, dropping in confusion and anger. "What in the hell is this?" one of them snarled, seeing the people huddled inside. "It's nothing, worthless," another said. In that moment of hesitation, Lila moved. The chain connecting her ankle shackles was long enough to give her a short, hobbled step. The lock that held her to the wagon wall had been shattered by a stray bullet. The wood around it splintered. She didn't wait. She didn't think. She launched herself out of the back of the wagon, landing hard on the rocky ground. Her hands were still bound, but her feet were free of the wagon. A bandit grabbed for her, but one of the captive men, in a last, desperate act of defiance, threw himself at the bandit's legs. A gun went off. Lila scrambled, crab-walking, then finding her feet, running in a hobbled, painful gait toward the rocks. "Get her!" one of the men yelled. A bullet kicked up dust by her feet. She didn't look back. She plunged into a narrow gap between 2 boulders, scraping her shoulders. The skin on her feet, bare and soft from weeks in the wagon, tore open on the sharp stones and thorns. She didn't feel the pain. She only felt the desperate, lung-burning need for freedom. The gunfire faded behind her as she climbed, pulling herself up with her chained hands. her breath sobbing in her chest. She ran until the sounds of the fight were gone, replaced by the rising whistle of the wind. She ran until her legs gave out and she fell, rolling down a sandy embankment into the relative cover of a dry wash. She lay there, gasping, tasting blood and dust. And for the first time in 10 years, she was alone, and she was free. Miles away, Eli rode his horse, a big roan gelding named Buster, toward Santa Fe. He rode with his shoulders slumped, the reins held loose in one hand. Eli was a man running from ghosts, and he knew they were faster than any horse. He'd just come from Texas, where a ranch deal had gone sour, went in with 2 partners, put up his last silver, and they'd run him off with threats and a drawn gun. It was just one more failure in a long line of them. He was a cowboy, had been all his life, but he was tired of it, tired of the dust, tired of the loneliness, tired of the man he saw in his reflection when he'd stopped to water his horse. He was running from the memory of a barn, bright with flames against a night sky. He was running from the smell of burning hay and the high, terrified scream of his younger brother, Sam, a scream that had stopped. He'd been 17. Sam had been 12. Eli was supposed to be watching him, but he'd been careless. Went to town, drank a little, came back too late. He'd tried to run in. His father had held him back, the man's arms like iron bands. While Eli watched the roof collapse, he'd blamed himself ever since. That fire had burned away his future. He left home a week later and never looked back. He'd wandered for 8 years, taking odd jobs on ranches, in mines, even sweeping out saloons. He never stayed long, the minute someone got close, or the minute he felt a moment of peace. The smell of smoke would come back, and he'd be gone by morning. He was riding toward Santa Fe for no good reason, except that it was a place he hadn't been in a while. The wind was picking up, starting to sting his face with sand. A dust storm was brewing. He hated these storms. They turned the world yellow and brown and made it hard to breathe. He pulled his hat low and urged Buster forward, looking for any kind of cover. Lila had been walking for hours. The sun was a dull red eye behind a growing wall of grit. The wind was howling now, a physical force that pushed her back, tore at her rags, and filled her mouth with sand. Her feet were hamburger. She'd stopped feeling the individual cuts and just felt a dull, throbbing burn with every step. Her chains were a terrible weight, banging against her shins, but she couldn't get them off. Thirst was a living thing inside her, a creature with claws, scraping her throat raw. She was dying. She knew it. She had escaped the wagon only to be killed by the land itself. It was a cruel joke. She stumbled, her knees hitting the hardpan. She saw a shape ahead, a dark skeleton against the yellow gloom. A dying tree, maybe a mesquite, its branches bare and twisted. She crawled to it, huddling against the meager trunk, which offered no shelter at all. The storm was a roaring monster, and she was in its belly. She closed her eyes. She was so tired. Maybe it was better this way, just to sleep. Eli almost rode right past her. Buster shied, snorting in alarm, and Eli pulled back on the reins, peering through the swirling dust. He saw a shape huddled at the base of a dead tree. A coyote, maybe, or a person. He dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He walked slow. The wind tore at his duster. "Hello?" he called out, his voice snatched away by the wind. The shape flinched. It was a person. A woman. She looked up, her eyes wide with pure, animal terror. She was a black woman, wearing nothing but torn rags, and she had chains on her wrists. Eli stopped. He'd seen this before. Runaway. He knew what the world did to them. He knew what the men who hunted them did. Lila tried to scramble back, pressing herself into the tree. She made a small, choked sound. She saw a big man, a white man, a gun on his hip. It was over. She had run all this way just to be caught by someone else. Eli saw her fear. He saw her battered feet. He saw the raw, red welts on her wrists from the irons. His first instinct was to keep riding. This was not his trouble. Getting involved was a good way to get shot. He had enough ghosts. He didn't need new ones. But he looked at her face, and he saw more than fear. He saw a fight that had just about gone out. And he thought of Sam. He thought of that barn, and the feeling of being too late. He slowly, deliberately, unhooked his canteen from his saddle. He held his hands up, open and empty, except for the water. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice low and rough, trying to pitch it under the wind. "You need water." Lila stared at him. She didn't move. Men lied. They lied with soft voices and they lied with fists. He saw the mistrust. It was as plain as the chains. He couldn't blame her. He stepped forward, slow, and placed the canteen on the ground, about 10 feet from her. Then he backed away, moving to stand by his horse. "It's yours," he said. She watched him for a long minute. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Finally, with a quick, darting movement, she grabbed the canteen. Her hands were shaking so bad she could barely get it open. She drank, the water spilling down her chin, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. She drank until it was half gone, then clutched it to her chest. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky and a biscuit, hard as a rock. He set them in the same spot and backed away again. She ate just as desperately, tearing at the jerky with her teeth. He watched her. She was small, but she had a strength in her shoulders. She hadn't broken, not yet. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or what had happened. He didn't need to. The chains and the bleeding feet told the whole story. "Storm's getting worse," he yelled over the wind. "We stay out here. We'll be buried by morning. I know a place. An old settler's cabin. Not far." She just stared at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "You can stay here if you want," he said, turning to his horse. "But you won't last the night." He swung up into the saddle. He looked down at her. "You can ride behind me. I won't lay a hand on you. You have my word." His word. What was that worth? The word of a man like him. But she looked at the yellow sky, a suffocating curtain of sand. She looked at her feet. She couldn't take another step. He was offering a chance. It might be a lie, but the storm was the truth. She made her choice. She stood up, wincing as her full weight settled on her feet. She walked to the horse. He offered a hand, but she ignored it, grabbing the saddle horn and pulling herself up, a gasp of pain escaping her as she settled behind him. Her chained hands rested awkwardly on the back of the saddle. "Hold on," he said. He didn't look back. He just turned Buster into the wind, and they disappeared into the grit. The cabin was half buried in sand, just like he said. It was a sad, collapsing little hut of adobe and splintered wood, its roof mostly gone. But one corner was still intact, and it was shelter from the wind. Eli got her inside, then went to take care of Buster, tying him in the lee of the cabin wall, giving him the last of his grain. When he came back inside, Lila was huddled in the farthest corner, as far from him as she could get. Her eyes followed his every move. The floor was dirt. Sand poured in through a dozen cracks. Eli dropped his saddlebags and pulled a small hatchet. He broke apart the remains of a table, a chair, something that had once been a home. He built a small fire in the broken-down hearth, using his flint and steel. It took time, the wind fighting to come down the chimney, but finally, a small, weak flame caught. The firelight pushed back the gloom. It threw their shadows, large and flickering, against the crumbling walls. Eli sat on his bedroll, his back to the wall, leaving the entire rest of the cabin to her. He didn't talk. He just stared into the fire, his face grim. Lila curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest. She watched him. He was a big man, and he looked tired. His clothes were worn. He hadn't shaved in days. He was armed. He had saved her, but that didn't mean he was safe. She was still a piece of property. He could be a bounty man himself, taking her to Santa Fe to sell her. The uncertainty was a cold sickness in her stomach. Eli wasn't thinking about her. He was watching the flames. And the flames were taking him back. He saw the red light on the hay bales. He smelled the smoke. He heard Sam yelling. His brother had been trapped in the loft. Eli had told him to wait there, that he'd be right back. He'd just gone to get a drink of water. A 5-minute mistake. He closed his eyes. The guilt was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. He'd been wandering ever since, trying to outrun it, but it was always there when he saw that woman in the storm. So helpless, so close to the end. It was like a second chance, a chance to not be too late. He couldn't save Sam, but maybe, just maybe, he could save her. It wasn't about her, it was about him. He knew that. It was a selfish kind of rescue, but it was all he had. Hours passed. The wind howled, a lonely, grieving sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth. The fire burned down to glowing orange embers. Eli eventually drifted into a restless sleep. His head slumped against his chest. His hat tipped over his eyes. Lila did not sleep. She waited. When his breathing deepened, when he'd been still for a long time, her body tensed. This was her chance. Her feet screamed in protest, but she slowly, silently, got up. She had to run. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust any of them. She took one step, then another, her bare feet making no sound on the sandy floor. She was almost to the door, a ragged hole covered by a piece of hide. She paused and looked back at him. The firelight cast a soft glow on his face. He looked younger in sleep, worn down and sad. His hand was resting on the floor, only a few inches from his holstered revolver. It was right there. He could have used it on her at any time. He could have done anything to her. The cabin was miles from anywhere. No one would ever know. But he hadn't. He had given her water. He had given her food. He had built a fire. And then he had gone to sleep, leaving his gun untouched. She stood there, frozen, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. He was just a man who was breathing, a man who was asleep. She looked at the door, at the howling darkness beyond, and then she looked at the small, dying fire and the sleeping man. She slowly, carefully, walked back to her corner. She sat down, pulling her legs back to her chest. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, throwing sand against the weak walls. Lila watched the man's chest rise and fall. Rise and fall. A single tear, hot and sudden, cut a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. She was still in danger. She was still lost. But as she sat there, in that ruined cabin, with a strange, armed man, she listened to the storm raging outside, and she felt the small pocket of warmth from the fire. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like prey. The light that crept into the ruined cabin was gray and thin. The wind had stopped its howling, leaving behind a dead, heavy silence. Lila woke with a start, her body stiff and cold. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw the embers of the fire, the crumbling walls, and the man. Eli was already awake, sitting just as she had last seen him, but his hat was off, and he was running a hand through his matted hair. He looked over at her, his eyes clear and tired. He didn't say good morning. He just nodded, a small acknowledgement that they had both survived the night. He stood up, his joints popping in the cold air, and went outside. Lila heard him talking, his voice low and calm. He was speaking to his horse. She crept to the doorway and watched. He was checking the roan's legs, rubbing its nose, giving it the last handful of oats from a small bag. He took care of the animal before he took care of himself. She noted that. He came back in, carrying his saddlebags and a small, heavy piece of iron he'd been using as a hammer. He walked over to her, and she flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. He stopped, keeping his distance. "Those irons," he said, nodding at her ankles. "We gotta get 'em off. You can't ride proper, and you sure can't walk." He set the iron bar down and pulled a file from his bag. He laid it on the ground near her. "I can do it, or you can, but it's gotta be done." Lila looked at the file. Then she looked at her hands, still chained. "Can't," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He nodded. "All right." He sat on the ground in front of her. Not too close. He gestured for her to extend her legs. She hesitated. This was the most dangerous moment yet. To let him put his hands on her. To be that close. But she looked at the heavy iron. And she looked at his face. It was steady. There was no cruelty in it. Just a tired kind of patience. Slowly, she stretched her legs out. Her bare feet were a mess of blood and dirt. He didn't wince. He just got to work. He laid the chain over the iron bar and began to file at one of the links. It was loud in the small space. A high, grating screech of metal on metal. It set her teeth on edge. He worked for a long time, his breathing steady, his focus entirely on the chain. He didn't look at her face. He just worked. After what felt like an hour, the link was thin. He took a smaller hammer from his bag, and with a few sharp, precise strikes, the link snapped. The chain fell away from her ankles. The sudden lightness was dizzying. She rubbed her raw, scarred skin. The feeling of freedom so strange it was almost painful. He then moved to her wrists. This was harder, more intimate. She had to hold her hands out to him. He was gentle, his calloused fingers barely brushing her skin as he positioned the file. The screeching started again. She closed her eyes, trying to go somewhere else in her mind. When the wrist shackles finally fell apart and hit the dirt floor with a dull thud, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Eli sat back on his heels. He looked at her feet. "Gotta wrap those," he said. He took a strip of clean enough cloth from his bag and his canteen. He poured a little water on the rag and, without asking permission, began to gently, impersonally, clean the grit from the cuts. Lila hissed in pain but didn't pull away. He worked quickly, then tore more cloth into bandages, wrapping her feet as best he could. He finished and stood up, moving back to his side of the fire. He put his gear away, his movements economical and practiced. "I'm heading north," he said, his back to her as he repacked his saddlebags. "Up toward Colorado territory. Folks say it's safer there, freer. You can come with me, or you can go your own way. It's your choice." Lila stared at him. A choice. It was a word she hadn't heard in a long time. Go her own way? Where? Into the desert, with no food, no water, and feet that couldn't carry her a mile? She was free of her chains, but she was just as trapped. He seemed to understand. He didn't press her. He put a little more jerky and another hard biscuit on the floor for her. "We'll rest today," he said. "Horse needs it. You need it. We'll ride out in the morning." He hadn't asked her to come, but he was making plans that included her. She looked at him, this quiet, sad-eyed man. He hadn't asked her what she was running from. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked for anything. He had just broken her chains and bandaged her feet. She ate the food, and when he was outside again, she found a corner and slept. A real deep sleep. For the first time in more than a year. The next morning, she said her first word to him, when he held out a hand to help her onto the roan. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. Her hand was small in his. He lifted her up, and she settled behind him on the saddle blanket. "Ready?" he asked. "Lila," she whispered. He paused. "What's that?" "My name. It's Lila." He nodded. "Eli." He nudged Buster, and the horse moved out, stepping over the sand dune that had almost buried the cabin, and pointed north. The land they rode through was a testament to God's anger. It was cracked and gray. The earth split open by a sun that gave no mercy. The plain stretched out in every direction, an endless, empty ocean of baked dirt and sharp rock. There was no life here. They passed the bleached white skeletons of cattle, their bones picked clean and scattered by coyotes. The air was so dry it hurt to breathe, and the only things that moved were the dust devils, little whirlwinds that spun across the flats like troubled ghosts. Lila rode behind Eli, her arms lightly holding his waist. It was the only way to stay on. At first, the touch was terrifying. She kept her body stiff, trying to put as much space between them as possible. But the gait of the horse forced them together. She could feel the hard muscles of his back, the warmth of him. After the first day, she stopped fighting it. It was just a fact. They rode in silence. The land didn't invite conversation. It demanded all your attention just to survive. Eli was a good traveler. He never pushed the horse too hard. He knew how to find water. Tiny seeps in rock faces or muddy springs hidden in gullies that Lila would have ridden right past. They ate little. Cold beans from a can. More jerky. At night, he would build a small, smokeless fire of greasewood. He gave her his bedroll. He slept on the hard ground, his saddle for a pillow, his rifle beside him. He never slept deep. The smallest sound, a skittering rock, the call of a night bird, and his eyes would be open, his hand on his gun. Lila would watch him from the warmth of the blanket, her fear slowly, being replaced by a kind of fragile wonder. After 4 days, they were running low on everything. Eli's face was drawn tight with worry, though he didn't speak of it. Then, on the 5th morning, they crested a low ridge and saw, hunkered down in a dip in the land, a trading post. It was a miserable-looking place, built of sod and driftwood, with a sagging porch and a single, clouded window. "We need supplies," Eli said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken in a day. He dismounted and told Lila to wait with the horse. She watched him walk in, his duster sweeping the dust. A minute later, the door flew open and a man came out, wiping his greasy hands on an apron. He was short, with a belly and small, piggy eyes. He looked at Buster, then he looked at Lila. His eyes lingered, moving over her with a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. Eli came out, his face hard. "Man wants to see the horse's shoes. Make sure he ain't stolen." "He ain't," Lila whispered. "I know." The storekeeper, a man who called himself Silas, waddled over. He barely glanced at Buster's hooves. His eyes were on Lila. "That's a fine-looking piece of property you got there." "Mr. Silas said, his voice slick. "Healthy, good teeth, I bet. You looking to sell? I know some fellas down in Santa Fe would pay top dollar. Even with the new laws, there's always a market." Lila's blood went cold. She froze. This was it. This was where Eli sold her for supplies. She had been a fool to trust him. But Eli didn't move. He just looked at Silas, and his eyes, which Lila had only ever seen as tired and sad, turned flat and cold as the iron of her chains. "She's my wife," Eli said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. Silas's greasy smile faltered. He looked from Eli's cold eyes to the butt of his revolver. Your wife? Well, no offense meant, mister. Just you can't be too careful. A man alone with—" "I said," Eli repeated, stepping forward, his shadow falling over the smaller man. "She's my wife. Now, I need flour, beans, and salt, and I need a pair of boots." He looked at Lila's bandaged feet. "For my wife." The storekeeper's nerve broke. "Yes, sir, right away, mister. Whatever you need. Boots, yes." He scrambled back inside, tripping over his own feet. Eli turned to Lila. She was shaking, her eyes wide. He looked at her for a long moment, then just nodded toward the door. "Go on, get your boots." She slipped off the horse and ran inside, her feet aching. Silas threw a pair of worn men's boots on the counter. These'll have to do. Smallest I got. Lila sat on the floor and pulled them on. They were too big, but they were thick leather. They were armor. Eli paid with a few silver coins. He packed the supplies onto Buster, and they rode out. Neither of them looked back at the trading post. They rode for hours, putting as many miles as they could between them and that place. That night, the fire seemed brighter. The air was cleaner. Lila sat across from Eli, watching him sharpen his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing was the only sound. "Why'd you do that?" she finally asked. Eli didn't look up. "Do what?" "Lie to that man. Call me you're that." He stopped sharpening. He stared at the blade. "Seemed easier than letting you be owned," he said gruffly. He put the knife away. "Easier than a gunfight, anyway, most days." Lila watched him. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't about righteousness or freedom. It was a practical choice. He had weighed the options, and her being owned was a problem he didn't want. It was the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for her. He hadn't saved her because she was a woman or because he was a good man. He'd saved her because she was a person, and her being unpersoned was, as he put it, not easy. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "My mama," she said, her voice soft. She was a midwife. She knew all the herbs, knew how to bring a baby into the world, how to ease a fever. She taught me some. Before they sent her to the fields, Eli was still, listening. My PA, I don't remember him, just that he was tall. They sold him when I was 5. Downriver. My mama broke after that. She traced a line in the dirt. I was freed, on paper, after the war. But the man I worked for, he tore the papers up, said they were lies. He had me transported, to be sold again, west, said no one would know the difference out here. She looked at him, her eyes dark. I've been on the run since I was 15. This was just the first time I got caught. The fire crackled. Eli stared into it, his face looking old. I ain't known a peaceful night's sleep since I was 17, he said, his voice low. Since the fire, he told her, not all of it, but pieces. A barn, a younger brother, a mistake that couldn't be undone. He was 12. Name was Sam. He trusted me. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. You ever think, he said, not looking at her, that you don't deserve to keep living, but you do anyway. You just keep breathing, and you don't know why. Lila looked at this broken man, who saw a mirror of his own guilt in her suffering. She understood. Oh, she understood that? She didn't say anything. She just nodded. They left the plains and began to climb. The land changed. The gray dirt gave way to red rock and scrub pine. The air grew thinner and colder. They were in the mountains now, and the going was slow. They had to dismount and lead Buster up steep, rocky trails. Lila's boots, though too big, saved her feet, but her legs ached with the effort. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned to a flat, bruised purple. The air grew still. Then flakes began to fall. Not a gentle snow, but a driving, wet flurry that turned the rocks slick and soaked them in minutes. The temperature plummeted. We gotta find cover, Eli yelled over the rising wind. They were on an exposed ridge. The wind cut at them, sharp as glass. Lila's hands, in thin gloves Eli had bought, were numb. Eli spotted it, a dark shadow under a massive overhang of rock. There! He pulled Buster toward it, Lila stumbling behind him. It was a shallow cave, a deep rock outcrop that offered shelter from the wind and snow. It was a miracle. They were soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Eli quickly got Buster settled in the back of the cave, then started a fire. It took him 3 tries, his hands shaking so badly he could barely strike the flint, but he got it, and a small, sputtering fire began to fight against the cold. They were in serious trouble. Their food was low, and this storm could last for days. Eli took his rifle. Stay here. Don't leave the fire. He disappeared into the white swirl. Lila huddled by the fire, terrified. He was gone for an hour. She was sure he was dead, that he'd fallen. Then he reappeared, a ghost covered in snow, dragging a rabbit. He skinned it with numb fingers and set it to stew in their small pot with a handful of dried beans and melted snow. They ate the rabbit stew from the same pot, passing it back and forth. It was hot and saved them. They sat side by side, huddled under Eli's single wool blanket, their shoulders touching. They watched the snow fall. It was quiet, and in that small cave, with the storm raging outside, they were the only two people in the world. That night, the cold was a living thing. The fire was small. Lila's dress, though she'd tried to dry it, was still damp and clinging to her. She was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling shake she couldn't stop. Eli looked at her. "You gotta get that dress dry," he said, "or you'll be sick by morning, and I can't fix that." Lila knew he was right. She moved to the other side of the fire, her back to him. Her hands fumbled with the buttons. She was clumsy with cold. She slipped the wet dress off her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. The firelight hit her bare back. She was wearing a thin chemise, but it was just as wet. Eli heard the rustle. He turned his head. He saw the firelight on her dark skin, the sharp line of her spine, the vulnerability of her bare shoulders. He snapped his head back, staring into the flames. His whole body went rigid. A jolt went through him, hot and sharp, and it terrified him. It was desire, simple and raw, but it was tangled up with a dozen other things. Guilt that he would see her that way. Shame that he would want her when she was so dependent on him. And a fierce, protective restraint that made his hands shake. He gripped his knees, his knuckles turning white, and forced himself to look at the fire, at the snow, at anything but her. Lila peeled the wet chemise off and quickly hung it and her dress on a rock near the fire, where they steamed. She was naked and freezing. She grabbed the wool blanket, wrapping it tight around her body, and sat back down. She sat beside him, not touching, but close. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the fire and the wind. He was still staring into the flames, his jaw set so hard she thought his teeth might break. He looked like he was in pain. She didn't understand. She only knew that she was cold, and he was warm. "You saved me," she whispered, meaning from the cold, from the storm. Eli closed his eyes. He let out a long, slow breath. He thought of the fire, of Sam. He thought of the 8 years he'd spent wandering, feeling nothing but guilt. Now, sitting next to this woman, he felt something else, a reason to keep breathing, a reason to fight the cold. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. "Not sure who's saving who," he said. The snow melted as they descended, trading the high country cold for the dry, biting air of the lower hills. They came upon the mining town at dusk, a raw scar carved into the side of a canyon. It was not a town. It was a camp, a long, muddy street lined with canvas tents, a few false front buildings made of raw pine, and 3 saloons, all of them spilling yellow light and the tinny sound of a worn-out piano. Miners, covered in red dirt, moved along the boardwalks, their faces hard and hopeful, which was its own kind of dangerous. This was a place built on luck and desperation. There were no families here, no laws, really. Just a crude sign that said sheriff tacked to a shack at the end of the street. Eli pulled Buster to a halt at the edge of the light. He was stiff, his face grim. The snowstorm had cost them 2 days and nearly all their food. "I gotta get supplies," he said, his voice low. "And I need to see if anyone knows this trail north. See if it's safe." "This place don't look safe," Lila whispered, her eyes scanning the men who leered at them from the saloon porches. "It ain't," Eli agreed. "Stay here. Stay on the horse. If anyone tries anything, you scream. And you ride. You hear me? You ride north and don't look back." Lila's stomach tightened. "Where will you be?" "General store, then the sheriff's, just to ask about the trail." He swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the mud. "I'll be quick." Lila watched him walk away, his tall frame moving with a purpose that separated him from the stumbling miners. She sat on Buster, her hands gripping the saddle horn, trying to look small, trying to be invisible. Every man who passed looked up at her. Their eyes were hungry, not just for a woman, but for anything that was different, anything they could take. Inside the sheriff's office, Sheriff Brody was rolling a cigarette. He was an older man who had taken the job because he was too slow for mining and too tired to run. A telegraph message had come in an hour before, clacked out from the station 2 towns over. It was from a man named Silas at a trading post on the flats. Brody read it again. "Be on watch. Runaway girl, Lila. About 20, traveling with a hard case, cowboy. Tall, brown hair, roan horse. Fella's dangerous. Likely armed, possibly wounded from a prior scrape." Brody had spat. A runaway. That meant bounty men. That meant trouble he didn't need. He'd tacked the message to his wall, next to a dozen wanted posters. Just then, the door opened, and a tall cowboy with brown hair walked in, his duster covered in trail dust. Brody's hand twitched toward his gun. "Sheriff," Eli said, nodding. He didn't look wounded. He just looked tired. "What can I do for you, stranger?" Brody asked, his eyes narrow. "Name's Eli. Me and my wife are passing through, heading north. Just wanted to ask about the trail. Heard the Apaches have been active?" Brody squinted. "Your wife, she outside?" "On the horse," Eli said, his voice flat. Brody leaned back in his chair. The man matched the description. The roan horse, and a black woman outside. "Wife," he'd said. "The telegraph said runaway." One of them was lying, and in Brody's experience, it was usually the man with the gun. "Trail's clear as far as I know," Brody said slowly. "But this ain't a good town to rest in. Folks get agitated." "I can see that," Eli said. He sensed the coldness in the room. "We'll be gone by morning." "See that you are," Brody said. When Eli walked out, he didn't look at Brody, who was already walking down the street toward the telegraph office. He walked to Lila, his steps measured. "We're leaving," he said, too quiet. "You got supplies?" "No." He looked up at her, his face pale in the twilight. "We gotta go, now." "What is it?" "The sheriff. He looked at me wrong. He knows, or he suspects." Just then, 2 men came out of the saloon across the street. They weren't miners. They were dressed in dark clothes, with good hats, and they wore their guns tied down low. They saw Eli, and then they saw Lila. One of them smiled, a slow, ugly movement, and nudged his partner. Eli saw it. "Damn it," he breathed. He grabbed Buster's reins. "Walk, slow, to the end of the street." But it was too late. The men were already crossing the mud, their hands loose by their hips. "That's a fine horse, mister," one of them called out. "Evening," Eli said, his body tensed, his hand near his colt. "And a finer prize sitting on him," the other man said, his eyes on Lila. "We got a message says a girl just like her is missing from down south." "She's my wife," Eli said, the words coming out like cold stones. "That's what the message said you'd say." The first man chuckled. "Makes this easy. We'll take her. You can live, or you can die. Makes no mind to us. The bounty's the same." The street had gone quiet. The piano music stopped. "Lila," Eli said, not taking his eyes off the men. "When I move, you ride. Don't stop." "No," she whispered. "I won't leave you." "You will." "It's 2 against 1. Cowboy," the bounty man said, his hand hovering over his gun. "It's 2 against 2, Lila said, her voice sharp. The men laughed. In that second, Eli moved. He didn't draw. He slapped Buster's flank. "Hard! Go!" he roared. The horse, startled, bolted. Lila screamed as she grabbed the horn, the horse lunging into a gallop. The bounty men, surprised, went for their guns. "Get her!" One man fired at the horse. The other raised his pistol at Eli. Eli drew, his motion a blur. He fired once. The man aiming at him spun, clutching his chest. The first man turned, his gun leveling at Eli. "You son of a—" Eli fired again, but the man fired at the same time. Lila, who had managed to turn the panicked horse, saw it all. She saw Eli's body jerk, a dark stain blossoming on his left shoulder. He staggered but stayed on his feet. He raised his gun to fire again, but the bounty man was already falling, his face hitting the mud. "Eli!" she screamed. "Get out of here!" he yelled, grabbing his shoulder. He ran, stumbling, toward the stables at the end of the street. "The stables!" Lila kicked Buster, wheeling him around, and galloped after him. Men were pouring out of the saloons, yelling. Shots were being fired, though no one knew at what. Eli burst through the stable doors. Lila was right behind him. She jumped off Buster as Eli slammed the doors and dropped the heavy wooden bar. "They'll be here in a minute," he panted, leaning against the wall, his face white. Blood was pouring through his fingers. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll live." He looked around. "There, that mule." He pointed to a sturdy-looking mule in a stall. "Get the saddle on him. Quick." Lila's hands were trembling, but she did it, her fingers fumbling with the buckles. Eli, one-handed, was loading his revolver. "There's a back gate," he said, nodding. "For wagons. We go out that way, into the rocks." She finished with the saddle. He pushed her toward Buster. "Get on. You first," she said, her voice stubborn. "Damn it, Lila, do as I say." He shoved her up into the saddle. He grabbed the mule's reins and unbarred the high-back gate. It swung open onto a dark, rocky alley. "Go!" She kicked Buster, and the horse jumped out into the night. Eli followed on the mule, his body hunched over. They scrambled up a steep goat path, rocks clattering behind them. Below, they could hear men shouting, their lanterns bobbing in the dark as they surrounded the stable. Lila and Eli didn't look back. They rode into the black, rocky back country, the only sound the clatter of hooves and Eli's ragged, painful breathing. They rode for hours. They rode until the sounds of the town were long gone. They rode until the horses were slick with sweat and the moon was high and cold. Eli stayed on the mule, but he was slumping, holding onto the pommel with his one good hand. Lila kept looking back at him. "We have to stop. Eli, you're bleeding." "Can't," he muttered. "They'll follow. They got dogs." "We have to stop." He didn't answer. A mile later, as they crossed a wide, dried riverbed, a gash of white sand and boulders under the moon. He just fell. He didn't make a sound. He just slid from the mule's back and landed in a heap on the sand. "Eli!" Lila was off Buster in a second, running to him. He was on his back, his eyes closed, his face the color of ash. The front of his shirt and his duster were black with blood. "Eli, wake up," she pleaded, shaking his good shoulder. He groaned, his eyes fluttering. "Sam?" he whispered. "The loft, I'm sorry. No, it's Lila. Eli, stay with me." He was unconscious again. Lila's whole body went cold with a terror so profound it almost stopped her heart. He was dying, in this empty, godless place. He was bleeding to death for her. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "You don't get to die. I don't let you." She looked around. They were exposed. She had to move him. She grabbed him under the arms. He was a heavy, dead weight. She pulled, straining, dragging him backward across the sand, toward a thicket of mesquite and boulders on the riverbank. It took her 10 minutes to move him 20 yards. She got him into the cover, hidden from the open, and propped him against a rock. She tied the horses in the thicket, where they couldn't be seen. Then she ran back to Eli. She had to see the wound. She ripped his shirt open. The bullet had gone in high on his shoulder, near the collarbone. It was a dark, ragged hole, still oozing blood. She didn't know if it had gone through. She felt his back. No exit wound. The bullet was still in there. Her mama's voice came to her, calm and clear, from a childhood she'd almost forgotten. "Clean the wound first, baby. Always clean the wound, and stop the bleedin'." She grabbed their canteens. She poured precious water onto a rag and cleaned the blood and dirt away. She pressed down hard, trying to stop the bleeding. Eli moaned, but didn't wake. The bullet, it had to come out. If it stayed, the fever would take him. She built a tiny fire, just a handful of dry sticks, shielding the light with her own body. She took Eli's long skinning knife. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold it. "Forgive me, Eli," she whispered. She held the tip of the blade in the hottest part of the flame, letting it glow red, then orange, then just black and shimmering with heat. She knelt beside him. She whispered soft prayers, fragments of hymns her mama used to sing. "Yea, though I walk, he leadeth me, be not afraid." She took a breath. She pressed the hot tip of the knife into the wound, widening the hole. Eli's body arched off the ground with a raw, inhuman scream. His eyes flew open, but they were blind with pain. I'm sorry," Lila sobbed, pushing deeper, probing for the bullet. She felt it, a hard lump against the bone. She used the tip of the knife to pry at it, her stomach heaving. The bullet, slick with blood, popped out and fell onto the sand. Lila fell back, gasping, her body slick with sweat. The ordeal was not over. "Now you burn it," her mama's voice said. "Burn the poison out." She heated the knife blade again, this time the flat of it. She took a piece of wood and shoved it between Eli's teeth. "Bite down." He was barely conscious, but he did it. She pressed the flat, glowing blade into the open wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Eli's muffled scream was horrible. Lila cried out with him. She held it there for 3 long seconds, then pulled it away. The wound was black and sizzling. The bleeding had stopped. Lila collapsed beside him. She put her head on her knees and cried, silent, racking sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the pain she had caused him, for the blood, for the fear. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she stopped. She wiped her face, got up, and went to find water. He faded in and out of a burning fever for 2 days. Lila never left his side. She found a small, muddy seep upstream and filled the canteens. She sat and watched him, bathing his face with a wet rag, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He was in the fire. He was back in that barn, calling for his brother. "Sam, hold on! Sam, I'm coming!" he'd yell, trying to sit up, his eyes wild. "Hush, Eli!" Lila would whisper, pushing him back down, her voice a low, soothing balm. "It's all right. I'm here." He would grab her hand, his own burning hot, his grip like iron. Don't let the roof fall. Eli, please!" He was Sam now, pleading with his older brother. "The roof ain't falling," Lila whispered, tears running down her face. "I got you. Sam is safe. You're safe." She sat with him, holding his hand, listening to his broken heart spill out into the darkness. She was no longer just a runaway. She was a keeper of his secrets, a guardian of his pain. She finally understood the ghost that rode with him. It wasn't just guilt, it was love, a desperate, broken love for a brother he couldn't save. On the 3rd day, their food was gone. Eli's fever was still high, but he was sleeping, no longer thrashing. Lila was starving. Her stomach ached. If she didn't eat, she couldn't help him. He had taught her. On the long ride, he had shown her things. How to read the land, how to see the almost invisible tracks of a rabbit, how to make a simple snare from a piece of cord. She had paid attention. She took the cord from his saddlebag. Her hands trembled, not just with hunger, but with the terrifying weight of responsibility. She was all alone. His life depended on her. She found a rabbit run, just as he'd shown her. She set the snare, her fingers clumsy. She sat and waited. She foraged, finding some bitter roots her mama had told her were safe, and a handful of juniper berries. It was almost dark when she heard the snap and the high, thin scream of the snared rabbit. She hated the sound, but she did what she had to do. She killed it, cleaned it, and cooked it over a tiny, smokeless fire. She ate half, her body shaking with gratitude. She chewed the other half, making a soft paste, and gently fed it to Eli. He swallowed, still asleep, but he took it. She sat in the dark, chewing on the last of the rabbit, the responsibility a heavy blanket. She was terrified, but she was also alive. She was a survivor. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. His skin was cool. Lila had fallen asleep, her head resting on his chest, her hand clutching his. She woke when his hand moved, his fingers weakly curling around hers. She sat up. His eyes were open. They were clear. He was looking at her. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. She held the canteen to his lips, and he drank, long and slow. He looked at his shoulder, at the crude, black-edged bandage. He looked at the remains of the fire. He looked at her face, smudged with soot and dirt, her eyes exhausted. He understood what she had done. His eyes filled with tears. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice a cracked rasp. Lila's own throat was thick. She squeezed his hand. "I didn't leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't." He was too weak to move, too weak to say more. She lay down beside him, her body curling against his good side. He was weak, but he was alive. She was exhausted, but she was strong. A deep, powerful tenderness flowed between them, more real than any touch, more binding than any words. It was the shared knowledge of survival, of sacrifice. Lynn, the fading starlight. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes closing. They didn't need to speak. They just breathed, their foreheads resting together. He was hers, and she was his, in a way that had nothing to do with chains or laws, and everything to do with blood and fire. They stayed by the dried riverbed for a week. It was a still, quiet time, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. Eli healed slowly. The first 2 days, he mostly slept, a deep, exhausted sleep that was free of fever. Lila hunted. She set her snares, and her skill, born of desperation, grew. She brought back rabbits, and once, a desert quail. She made broth, feeding it to him. She cleaned his wound, her touch now practiced and firm, her fear replaced by a quiet competence. He would wake and watch her as she worked, moving about their small, hidden camp. He watched her mend her own clothes with a needle and thread from his kit. He watched her brush her hair, her motions slow and rhythmic. He was quiet, his weakness forcing a stillness on him that was unnatural. But it gave him time to see her, really see her, not as a person he was saving, but as the person who had saved him. On the third day, he sat up on his own, his back against the rock. The pain was still a fire in his shoulder, but his head was clear. Lila brought him a tin cup of water. He took it, their fingers brushing. "You're a good nurse," he said, his voice still rough. "My mama was," Lila said, sitting back on her heels. "She taught me herbs. I found some yarrow. Put it on the bandage. It stops the bleeding." "It worked." He looked at the clean bandage. "You did all of it. The knife, the fire." Lila just nodded, her eyes on the ground. "I wouldn't have done it for myself," Eli said quietly. "I'd have just let it be." "You talk nonsense," she said, her voice sharp, but her hands were trembling. "You'd have fought. You always fight." "I was tired of fighting," he said. "Been tired for 8 years." A silence settled between them, heavy and real. Lila traced a pattern in the sand, the same pattern she had drawn the night he admitted his guilt about his brother. "I never," she began, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear. "I never thought I'd see the day that a white man would choose to bleed for me, let alone die." She looked up, her eyes clear and searching. "Those men in that town, you could have given me to them. You could have walked away. You could have saved yourself. Why didn't you?" Eli looked at his hands. He thought of the fire. He thought of the long, empty years of running, of feeling like a ghost. He thought of the dust storm, and the terror in her eyes when he found her. He thought of the cave, and the way her bare shoulders looked in the firelight. He thought of how she had held his hand in the dark, calling him back from his fever dreams, pulling him back from the smoke and the guilt. He met her gaze. "When Sam died, he said, his voice thick. I figured my life was over, that I was just walking around, waiting to be done. I didn't want to live. I just did, because I had to. He looked at her, at the strength in her face, a strength that had been forged in a fire far hotter than his. You're the first person I've wanted to live for, Lila, the very first. Lila's breath caught. She saw no lie in his eyes, only a deep, aching truth that matched her own. He wasn't saving her to atone for his brother. He was saving her to save himself. It was a bond forged not in pity, but in a shared, desperate need to find a reason. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, and a single tear, the one she hadn't shed when she cut him, finally fell. She wiped it away, angry and embarrassed. Well, she said, her voice practical again. You keep living. I'm going to check my snares. We'll need food if we're to ride out tomorrow. They left the riverbed 2 days later. Eli was weak. He had to be helped onto Buster, and he rode slumped, his bad arm in a sling Lila had made. She rode the mule, leading the way. They moved north, leaving the cracked, dry country behind. The land changed. It rose into high forests of pine and aspen. The air was cold, and the ground was damp. The shadows were long, even at midday, and the world was quiet, muffled by a thick carpet of pine needles. It was beautiful, but it was a lonely, watchful kind of beauty. The nights were colder. Their fires were bigger. They huddled close, sharing the one bedroll and all their blankets, their bodies finally touching for warmth. It was a chaste, desperate closeness. Lila would lie stiffly, her back to him, listening to his breathing, feeling the warmth of his body seep into hers. He would lie awake, his good arm under his head, staring into the darkness, his mind full of the nearness of her. They were more alone together than they had been on the plains. The shared space was smaller, the silence deeper. After a week of slow travel, they came to a valley hidden between two high, timbered ridges. A thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney. This is it, Eli said, his voice relieved. It was a small, sturdy cabin, its logs chinked tight with mud. A woman was outside, chopping wood, her motions strong and practiced. She had a long, dark braid down her back and a face that was a map of sun and wisdom. She looked up as they approached, her axe held loosely at her side. Eli, she said, her voice warm, no surprise in it. You look like hell, and you've brought a friend. Brigitte, Eli said, managing a weak smile. I brought trouble, is what I brought. You always do. She walked over and looked at Lila, her dark eyes kind but missing nothing. She saw the rags, the exhaustion, and the way Lila looked at Eli. Then she looked at Eli's bandaged shoulder. Get inside. Both of you. There's stew. Brigitte was Métis, her father a French trapper, her mother Cree. She had known Eli since he was a boy, just starting his wandering. Her cabin was a way station, a safe place for those who lived on the edges. She took them in without question. She gave them a small room in the attic, with a real mattress stuffed with straw and 2 thick furs. She examined Eli's shoulder. Her lips pursed. This is good work, she said, looking at Lila. You used fire. I had to, Lila said. Yes, you did. Brigitte nodded, a mark of respect. He will heal, but he is a fool. He always was. They rested there for 3 nights. It was the first time Lila had slept under a real roof, in a real bed, and as long as she could remember. She ate hot stew and fresh bread. She helped Brigitte feed the chickens and mend a fence. Eli mostly slept, the deep, healing sleep of a safe house. On the second evening, Eli was asleep. Lila was sitting by the fire with Brigitte, helping her card wool. He is a good man, Brigitte said quietly, not looking up from her work. But he is broken. Lila stopped, her hands still. I know his story. The fire, the boy. He carries that ghost everywhere. Brigitte finally looked at Lila, her eyes sharp. You carry ghosts, too. I see them. Lila looked into the fire. Yes. Be careful, little bird, Brigitte said, her voice soft. Men with broken hearts often carry knives inside. They do not mean to cut you, but they are sharp, and they are pointed inward. Sometimes, when you get too close, you get cut all the same. Lila thought of his confession. You're the first person I've wanted to live for. Was that a promise? Or was it just another kind of knife? I know, Lila whispered. I've been cut before. Then you know to be smart, Brigitte said, and went back to her carding. The next day, Eli was walking. His color returned. He found Lila by the woodpile. Where she was watching him, he was holding his revolver. You need to know how, he said. He held it out to her. But first, it was heavy, so much heavier than she'd imagined. Black iron, worn smooth on the grip. I don't know, she said, her hands trembling. You do, he said. Brigitte's right. I bring trouble, and those men from the town, they won't be the last. I can't always be awake. I can't always be fast enough. He showed her how to load it, how to check the cylinder, how to pull the hammer back, the loud, solid click-click of it. It's heavy, he said. So you use two hands. You don't aim like in the stories. You point. You point at the biggest part of him, and you pull the trigger. And you don't stop pulling until he's down. He set up a tin can on a fence post. Lila raised the gun. It wavered in her hands. She took a breath, held it, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed her shoulders, and she stumbled back. The can was untouched. Again, Eli said, his voice calm. She shot again and again. The can was safe. She was frustrated, her arms aching. You're afraid of it, Eli said. Don't be. It's just a tool, like your mama's herbs. Like my knife. You're aiming at the can. Don't. What do I aim at? She asked, her voice tight with frustration. What are you angry at? He asked. Lila stopped. She thought of the men in the wagon. She thought of the storekeeper, Silas. She thought of the bounty hunters. She thought of the man who tore up her papers. She thought of all the ghosts, the men who had looked at her like she was a thing to be used, bought and broken. She raised the gun, her arms steady now. She saw the face of the man who had chained her. She pulled the trigger. The can flew off the post, spinning into the air. She lowered the gun, her hands shaking, but not from fear. I've been aiming at ghosts my whole life, she said. Eli looked at her, his face a mixture of pride and a deep, profound sadness. He knew exactly what she meant. He just nodded and handed her more bullets. They left Brigitte's a day later, with new supplies, a mule loaded with food, and a new, unspoken tension between them. Eli had given her the gun. It was in her waistband, a cold, heavy weight. They rode into a small town on the edge of the mountains, a place that lived on logging. They needed salt, coffee, and ammunition. This time, we both go, Eli said, and we stay together. They walked into the general store. It was crowded with big men in plaid shirts, all of them smelling of pine and whiskey. Lila kept her head down, her hand near her coat, where the gun was hidden. Eli was at the counter, his back to her, paying for the supplies. Well, I'll be... A voice slurred from behind her. Look what we got here. Lila froze. She knew that voice. She turned. It was one of the men, one of the guards from the transport wagon, the watchful one, the one who spat tobacco, the one she'd thought was killed in the ambush. He was alive. He had a long, puckered scar on his cheek she didn't remember, but it was him. His eyes lit up with a greedy, ugly recognition. It is you, the little runaway. He lunged, grabbing her arm. You're coming with me, girl. There's a $1,000 bounty on your head now. Another man, a logger friend of his, grabbed Eli from behind, pinning his good arm. Hold on there, cowboy. This is official business. Eli roared, twisting, slamming his bad shoulder into the man's face. But the man held on. The guard was dragging Lila toward the door. I'm gonna be rich, Lila reacted. She didn't think. She didn't aim at a ghost. She aimed at him, She pulled the knife Eli had given her, the skinning knife she had used to save his life, from her boot, and lunged up, plunging it deep into his thigh. He screamed, a high, wet sound, and let go, collapsing to the floor, clutching his leg as blood pumped out between his fingers. Eli, free for a second, turned to face the logger, but the man was faster, pulling his own gun. Lila, seeing it, didn't hesitate. She pulled Eli's revolver from her waistband, pointed it at the center of the man's chest, and pulled the trigger. The store went silent. The logger looked down at the red spot on his shirt, his eyes wide with surprise, before he crashed backward into a barrel of crackers. Lila was breathing, gasping, the smoking gun still held out in front of her. Eli stared at her, his face shocked. Then he grabbed her hand. "Run!" They ran out of the store, leaving the mule, leaving the supplies. They grabbed Buster and vaulted onto his back, Eli in front, Lila behind, her arms locked around him. They galloped out of town, bullets whining past their ears. They rode until the horse was foaming, then dismounted and ran on foot, scrambling up a steep bank into the deep woods. They didn't stop until they were miles away, hidden in a thicket of ferns and pine. Lila collapsed, her whole body shaking, the gun falling from her numb hand. She bent over and was sick. Eli slumped against a tree, his face pale, his hand pressed to his shoulder. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her voice hollow. He looked at his hand. It was dark with fresh blood. The fight, the ride, it had torn the wound open. "It's nothing," he panted. "It's not nothing," she suddenly screamed at him, her voice cracking. "It's your life. You're bleeding again. For me. You'll die. They'll kill you. All for me." She crawled to him, grabbing the front of his shirt. "Let me go. Eli, please. Just let me go. Ride south. Ride anywhere. Tell them I forced you. They'll let you live. But I'll only get you killed." She was sobbing now, hitting his chest with her fists. "Let me go." Eli looked at her, his face tight with pain, but his eyes were clear. He grabbed her wrists with his one good hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He held her still. "Lila," he said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "Look at me." She quieted, her sobs catching in her throat, and met his eyes. "I'm not letting you go." He was breathing hard, the blood seeping between his fingers. "They can hunt us. They can shoot me full of holes, but I am not letting you go." He leaned his head back against the tree, the pain making him weak. "I'd bleed every drop I have," he whispered, his voice shaking with the force of his words. "Every last drop, if it means you walk free." Lila stopped crying. She just stared at him. He wasn't being noble. He wasn't being a hero. He was stating a fact. It was a truth as solid as the tree he was leaning on, as real as the blood on his shirt. She watched him slump, his eyes closing in pain but not in defeat. She watched this man, who had been a stranger in the dust, willingly bleed for her. Not for a memory, not for a ghost, for her. And in that cold, silent forest, with the smell of pine and gunpowder in the air, she finally, truly understood what it meant. This was his love. It was not soft. It was not easy. It was raw, and it was wordless, and it was as real as the gun still cooling in her hand. It was the only kind of love that could survive a place like this. And it was all for her. Lila pulled Eli to his feet, his dead weight leaning on her, his breathing already ragged and wet. "We can't stay here. Eli, we can't." She got him onto Buster, the horse skittering, smelling the blood in the air. She scrambled up behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, holding him upright, and kicked the horse into a desperate run. They fled back into the deep woods, leaving the town, the mule, and their last bit of safety behind. This time, there was no safe riverbed. There was no time to rest. They were being hunted. Lila knew it. The guard from the wagon would have a posse on their trail before the sun set. They had to disappear. "Where, Eli?" she pleaded, her voice tight against his back. "Where can we go?" He was slumped forward, his head down. He was weak, but he was conscious. "High," he muttered. "Go high, into the passes. They won't follow. Not in this weather. Too hard." So she pushed Buster up. They left the trails and climbed, fighting through thick brush and over slick rock. When the horse could go no further, they dismounted. Lila half carried, half dragged Eli, pulling him up steep, rocky inclines. He helped as much as he could, his one good hand gripping rocks, his legs shaking. That night, she didn't build a fire. They hid in a cleft between two boulders as a cold. Sharp rain started to fall. Lila tore open his shirt again. The wound was a mess, ripped open and bleeding badly. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice a harsh whisper. She had no fire to heat a knife. She had no time for herbs. She took the last of their whiskey, the small flask Brigitte had given them, and poured it directly into the open wound. Eli screamed. A raw, muffled sound he bit back against her shoulder. His whole body convulsed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her own tears hot on her cheeks. "I'm sorry." She packed the wound with the cleanest cloth she had and bound it tight. So tight he gasped for breath. But the bleeding slowed. They shivered in the cold, wet dark, huddled under a single blanket, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Lila held him, her gun in her free hand, and she did not sleep. She just watched the rain, and she listened. Winter settled in hard after that. It came not as a gentle blanket of white, but as an enemy, a siege. The sky hung low, a solid bruised sheet of steel clouds that pressed down on the mountains, smothering the light. They were in the high peaks now, a place of wind-scoured rock and skeletal pines. Few men would dare to climb this high, not with the snows coming. It was exactly why Eli had chosen it. They found a shallow cave, barely an overhang, but it faced away from the wind. It was their home. Survival became a bleak, minute-to-minute routine. Eli's shoulder was healing, but the cold stiffened it, and he was in constant pain. He was no longer the strong protector. He was her partner. Lila became the hunter. She set her snares, but the rabbits were scarce this high up, and the cold made them sluggish. She learned to trap ptarmigan, white birds that were almost invisible against the snow. She learned to find the inner bark of pines that could be boiled into a bitter, turpentine-tasting tea that kept the hunger at bay, if not satisfied. Eli, his arm in a sling, did what he could. He kept the fire, a small, precious thing that they never let die. He used his good hand to carve, making triggers for her snares, mending their worn-out boots with scraps of leather. They spoke little. The vast, cold silence of the mountains seeped into them. They were two small, warm specks in a world of ice. They moved around each other with a quiet, practiced grace, their bond forged not in words, but in the shared work of staying alive. One gray afternoon, Lila was checking a line of snares she'd set along a ridge. Eli was back at the cave, a few hundred yards below. The air was dead still, the snow muffling every sound. It felt wrong. A sound, a snap, not a snare, a twig. Lila froze. She crouched behind a snow-covered boulder, her hand moving to the revolver in her belt. She waited. Nothing, just the vast, white silence. Then, a man stepped into view. He was not a bounty hunter from the town. He was something else. He was dressed in greasy buckskins and a wolf fur hat. He moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning the snow, following her tracks, which she had thought were invisible. A tracker, a hired hunter. He hadn't seen her yet. He was looking down toward the faint wisp of smoke from their cave. He smiled, a slow parting of a chapped, bearded mouth. Lila raised the gun. Her hands were steady. She remembered. Point, center mass, don't stop. But before she could pull the trigger, the man stiffened. He had heard something. Eli. Eli was coming up the path, a handful of firewood in his good arm. He hadn't seen the hunter. "Eli!" Lila screamed. The hunter spun. He saw Eli, a more immediate threat, or perhaps just the man he was hired to kill. He didn't go for his gun. He moved with a terrifying, fluid speed, pulling a long knife from a sheath on his hip and throwing it in one smooth motion. It was aimed at Eli's chest. Eli, dropping the wood, tried to dive, but his bad shoulder made him clumsy. The knife, thrown from 50 feet, wasn't a killing blow, but it was close. It sank, hilt deep, into the thick muscle of his right thigh. Eli yelled, a sharp, guttural cry, and fell, grabbing his leg, his hand trying to pull his own gun from its holster. The hunter laughed and started pulling his rifle from his shoulder. Lila didn't think. She stood up. "Hey!" The hunter turned, his rifle coming up, his eyes finding her. She fired. The sound was huge in the silence, echoing off the peaks. The man's head snapped back, his fur hat flying off. A dark, blossoming hole appeared in his throat. He looked surprised. He gurgled, his hands dropping his rifle, and clawed at his neck. He took one step, then another, and then fell face first into the snow. Lila stood there, the gun still smoking in her hand, the echo of the shot rolling away into the distance. Silence. The man in the snow did not move. Eli was on the ground, groaning, trying to pull the knife from his leg. The sight of the blood, so much of it, black against the white snow, shook Lila. The man she had just shot the blood. Her stomach heaved. She turned, leaned against the boulder, and threw up, her body convulsing in dry, racking heaves. There was nothing in her stomach to bring up. She didn't cry. She just shook. A deep, terrible palsy that started in her hands and spread through her whole body. She slid down the rock and collapsed into the snow, her legs giving out. "Lila!" Eli's voice, tight with pain, cut through her haze. "Lila, I'm all right, but I can't get this thing out." His voice. He was alive. She got up, her legs like water. She stumbled over to him. He was pale, his teeth gritted. The knife was buried in his leg. "He's dead," Eli panted. "Yes," she whispered. "Good." He looked at the knife. You gotta pull it out." She grabbed the handle. "This is gonna hurt." "It already hurts," he grated. "Just do it." She pulled. It was slick, and it was deep. She had to brace her boot against his leg and pull with both hands. It came free with a sick, wet sound. Blood poured out. Lila ripped a strip from her own shirt and pressed it against the wound. It's just too much," she suddenly whimpered, the cold and the fear and the killing all crashing down on her. I can't." She collapsed onto him, her body shaking. She clutched his face, her cold fingers on his cheeks. "Don't you leave me," she whispered, her voice fierce and desperate. "Don't you dare. You're all I have. You can't leave me here. Eli, please, don't leave me." He looked up at her, his face a mask of pain, but his eyes were clear. He put his good hand over hers. "I ain't going anywhere. Lila, I'm right here. But we gotta get to the cave. A storm's coming." She looked up. The steel-gray sky had turned a bruised, swirling black. The wind was picking up, and snow had begun to fall, thick and fast. They made it to the cave just as the blizzard hit. It wasn't a storm. It was a white monster, a roaring, blind fury that erased the world. Snow fell so thick they couldn't see the rocks 20 feet away. The wind howled through the pass, a high, screaming keen that sounded like a legion of ghosts. Lila dragged Eli inside. She bandaged his leg, her hands finally steady, her panic replaced by a cold, hard focus. The wound was deep, but it had missed the bone. He would live. They huddled by their small fire, piling on the last of their wood. The snow began to drift, piling up at the mouth of their cave, a white wall that was sealing them in. For 3 days, the world ended. The sun vanished. The sky vanished. There was nothing but the white, roaring dark and the cold. The wind was so loud they had to shout to be heard. Their firewood ran out on the 2nd day. Their food was gone. The fire died, leaving them in a freezing, howling twilight. Hunger was no longer an ache. It was a living, gnawing animal inside them both. They lay under their pile of furs and blankets, their bodies pressed together, sharing every last spark of warmth. The cold was a physical weight, pressing the life out of them. Eli was shivering, his leg wound aching. Lila was numb, her hands and feet long past feeling. "I'm sorry, Eli," she whispered, her breath fogging in the air. "I brought you to this. I got you killed." "Hush," he whispered back, his voice weak. He turned, his body aching, and pulled her closer. "We ain't dead yet. We're so cold." "I know." He held her, his arms wrapped around her. She burrowed her face into his chest, into the small pocket of warmth. She could feel his heart, beating slow and steady under her ear. And he could feel hers. They were just two people, in the dark, in the cold, at the end of the world. Everything else had been stripped away. There were no bounty hunters, no pasts, no ghosts, no color. There was just a man and a woman, and the last fading warmth of their lives. He tilted her chin up with his cold fingers. His eyes, even in the gray gloom, were fixed on hers. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw all the words he had never said. The respect, the fear, the need, the love. He lowered his head and touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of reverence. It was as chapped and cold and real as the rock they were leaning on. It was a promise. It was a prayer. She kissed him back, a quiet, desperate answer. There, in the freezing dark, with the wind screaming outside, their bodies finally came together. It was not a taking, it was a giving, a quiet, reverent huddling of two souls, trying to create one last spark of warmth. It was the only honest thing in a world of lies, the only living thing in a world of ice. It was slow, and it was careful, and it was as though it were the only moment that had ever existed, or ever would. Afterward, they lay tangled together. The shivering stopped, their shared warmth a fragile miracle. They were still hungry. They were still trapped, but they were not alone. The storm broke on the fourth morning. The silence was as sudden and stunning as the gunfire had been. Lila woke first. A sliver of bright, painful sunlight was cutting through a gap in the snowdrift. She was lying on Eli's good side, her head on his chest. He was asleep. She watched him, the new light tracing the hard lines of his face. He looked peaceful, the pain and the ghosts finally quiet. She gently, with one finger, traced the scar on his shoulder, the puckered, burnt flesh she had made. It was a part of him now. A part of her was a part of him. He opened his eyes, wincing as the light hit them. He looked at her. A slow, weak smile touched his mouth. "You're alive," he whispered. "So are you," she said. She kept her finger on his scar. "Your skin has stories," she said, her voice soft. "So does mine. I got 'em on my back. From the whip. I got 'em on my ankles. From the chains." She met his eyes. Maybe they belong together now. The stories. Maybe they make one new story. Eli put his hand over hers, pressing her fingers to his scar. He didn't speak for a long time. He just held her hand there. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice thick. "I think they do." He cleared his throat. "When we get out of here, if we get out, I ain't going north no more." "No? No. North is just more of this. More hiding. I know a place. West, in California. A big ranch, in a valley. A man I knew from Texas. A freedman. He runs it. Him and his people. They take folks in. Folks like us. Said it was safe. California," Lila whispered. It sounded like a word from a dream. That's a long way. It's a long way," he agreed. "But it's a place to go to, not just a place to run to. What do you say?" Lila looked at the wall of snow, and then at his face. "I say we gotta dig our way out of here first." It took them a full day to dig out. They were weak, dizzy with hunger, but they had a purpose. They got out into the bright, blinding sun. The world was new, covered in a clean, perfect sheet of white. They found the hunter's body, already half covered. Eli took his rifle, his ammunition, and the pack on his back. It had food, dried meat, hardtack, and beans. The man had saved their lives. They ate, their first real food in days, and it gave them strength. "West," Eli said, pointing toward the sun, which was already beginning to dip. They started the long walk down the mountain. Out of the high, cold country, they were heading west. They had a plan. They had a story. They were almost to the tree line when they saw it. A burned-out cabin. Its chimney a black, jagged tooth against the snow. It was an old settler's place, long abandoned. But something was wrong. As they got closer, Lila saw them. Two shapes, hanging from the high crossbeam of the cabin's porch. They were bodies. Two men. Black men. Their clothes were torn, their faces frozen in a final, awful expression. They were strung up, their feet dangling a yard above the snow. As a warning, Lila stopped. The food she had just eaten turned to acid in her stomach. These were runaways. Like her, they had come this way, maybe looking for shelter in the cabin, and they had been found. She saw the tracks, horses, a lot of them, a posse. This was what the world did. This was the justice it offered. She broke, all the strength that had gotten her through the shooting, the blizzard, the hunger. It vanished. She fell to her knees in the snow and let out a sound, a low, animal wail of grief and terror that she had been holding in since the day she was chained in the wagon. She wept for the men. She wept for herself. She wept for the sheer, unending cruelty of it all. Eli stood for a long moment, his face hard as the rock around them. He looked at the bodies, then at Lila, sobbing in the snow. He didn't say a word. He walked past her, his new limp pronounced. He went to the cabin. He used his good arm and the hunter's rifle to push, to pull, to break the frozen ropes. The bodies fell, stiff and awkward, into the snowdrift. He began to cover them. He couldn't dig. The ground was iron, so he gathered stones, one by one. From the burned-out chimney, he piled them over the two men, building a crude cairn, a small monument of respect in a world that had none. It took him an hour. When he was finished, he was breathing hard, his leg and shoulder on fire. He walked back to Lila. She was quiet now, her face streaked with tears, her eyes empty. He pulled her to her feet. "Don't look," he said. He turned her away from the cabin. He pointed west. "We keep moving," he said, his voice flat and hard. "There ain't no justice here, Lila. There's no fairness. There's just this." He gestured to the mountains, the snow, the bodies. "The only justice is staying alive. That's it. We just stay alive." He put his good arm around her, and they started walking, leaving the stones and the burned cabin behind them, heading toward the setting sun. They crossed into what the maps called Nevada territory, but the land itself had no name. It was a high, lonely desert, a vast, empty bowl of sagebrush and alkali flats, rimmed by distant, purple mountains. The air was thin and sharp, and the sun was a pale, cold disk. They had walked down from the snows, and now they were in a different kind of wilderness, a quiet one. They had Buster, who was now their shared burden and their shared hope. They had the hunter's rifle, which Lila carried. Eli, his legs still stiff and his shoulder a constant, dull ache, carried his own revolver. Lila wore the other one, tucked into her waistband, the metal always cold against her skin. They were a strange, scarred pair, moving west, two shadows in a landscape that swallowed shadows whole. They had been traveling for a month since the blizzard. They were lean, all the softness burned away. They were also a team. They moved without speaking, each knowing their job. He scouted for water. She hunted for game. At night, they sat by the fire, his good side pressed against hers, and he would tell her stories. Not of his past, but of California, of the valley he was taking her to, a place of green grass and rivers, and folks who wanted nothing but to be left alone. Lila would listen, her head on his good shoulder. She wanted to believe him, but she had learned that hope was a dangerous thing. It made you soft. She preferred the cold, hard weight of the gun. She preferred to watch the horizon. They were in a narrow, rocky pass, a shortcut that Eli said would shave a week off their journey to the Carson River. The walls of the canyon were high and red. It was quiet. Too quiet. "I don't like this," Lila said, her hand resting on the butt of her revolver. "It feels like a trap." "It's the fastest way," Eli said, his eyes scanning the rocks above. "We'll be through it by noon." He was wrong. A man stepped out from behind a tall spire of rock, blocking the path. He was not a hunter. He was not a miner. He was dressed in a good black coat, worn and dusty, and a flat-brimmed hat. He was holding a double-barreled shotgun, and it was pointed not at Eli, but at Lila. Lila froze. Her blood turned to ice. She knew this man. His name was Harlan. He had been the new overseer on the plantation she was taken from, the man who had arranged her sale, the man who had torn her papers and laughed. She had not seen him on the transport wagon, but she remembered his face from her nightmares. He had small, dead eyes. "Well, well," Harlan said, his voice a smooth, polite drawl that was more terrifying than any yell. "Lila, I have been looking for you for a very, very long time. You have cost me a great deal of money. The $1,000 bounty barely covers my trouble." Eli had moved, his body placed instantly between Lila and the shotgun. His hand was on his gun. "Who are you?" Eli said, his voice a low growl. "I'm the man who owns the property you stole," Harlan said, his eyes still on Lila. He hadn't even looked at Eli. "She's a runner, and a thief, and now, a killer. You've been busy, haven't you, girl?" "She ain't property," Eli said, "and she ain't yours." Harlan finally shifted his gaze to Eli. He looked him up and down. He saw the sling on his arm, the limp in his leg. He saw a broken-down cowboy, half dead already. "You," Harlan said with a sneer. "You're the one from the town, the one who shot up my men. You've been wounded. You look like you're about to fall over." He smiled. "I have a deal for you. Cowboy, you're just a hired hand. I get it. You were helping the poor, lost girl. Very noble. But your part is over." He gestured with the shotgun. "You give her to me, right now. You drop your guns, you get on your horse, and you ride away. You walk away alive. I get my property. And you get to see another sunrise. It's a good deal. It's the only deal." Lila's hand was shaking. She was back in the wagon. She was back on the plantation. He had found her. After all this, he had found her. "Eli," she whispered, her voice choking. "Don't." Eli didn't look back at her. He just kept his eyes on Harlan. He saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. He saw the coldness in his eyes. There was no deal. There was only this. "You're right," Eli said. "It's a good deal." Harlan's smile widened. "Smart man. Now, drop the—" Eli shot first. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He drew and fired in one motion, a desperate, fast draw that was all arm and no aim. His bullet tore a hole in Harlan's coat, making the man stumble back, but the shotgun was already up. The roar of the blast filled the narrow canyon, a deafening explosion that echoed off the rocks. Eli's body was lifted off his feet. He was hit square in the gut, the force of the blast throwing him backward. He landed on the ground, a crumpled heap, his gun spinning away in the dust. "Eli!" Lila screamed. Harlan staggered, clutching his side where Eli's bullet had grazed him. He was furious. He dropped the empty shotgun and pulled a large revolver from his belt. He was turning, bringing it up to finish Eli. Lila didn't think. She didn't feel. She just acted. She pulled her revolver, the one Eli had given her, the one she had practiced with. She didn't aim at a ghost. She aimed at the center of his chest. She pulled the trigger. The shot was clean. Harlan stopped. A small, dark hole appeared on his white shirt. He looked surprised. She fired again. The second shot hit him higher. In the throat. He gurgled, his eyes wide. He tried to raise his gun, but his arm was heavy. Lila took a steady step forward and fired a third time, right into his heart. Harlan fell backward, his gun firing into the sky, and did not move again. The silence that fell was absolute. The smell of sulfur and blood filled the air. Lila stood there for a second, the gun heavy in her hand, smoking. Then she dropped it and ran. "Eli! Eli!" She fell to her knees beside him. It was bad. It was worse than anything. The shotgun blast had torn him open. There was so much blood. It was a wound she could not fix. No fire, no herbs, no bandage could stop this. "Oh, God, no," she whispered, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him. "No, please, no." He opened his eyes. His face was pale, covered in a cold sweat, but he was calm. He wasn't in pain anymore. He was just cold. He looked past her, at the body of Harlan. You did it," he whispered. "I did it," she sobbed, finally touching him, trying to hold him, to push the life back in. "Don't go! Eli, please don't leave me! You can't leave me!" He managed a small, weak smile. He raised his hand, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. "You're free now, Lila," he whispered, his voice so faint she had to lean down to hear him. That's all I ever wanted. I don't want to be free," she cried, her tears falling onto his face. "I want you." "You got me," he breathed. His eyes lost their focus. His hand fell from her cheek, and he was still. "Eli, Eli." She shook him, her voice a raw scream in the silent canyon. But he didn't move. His eyes were open, but he was gone. She fell onto his chest, her body convulsing with a grief so total, so absolute, that it emptied her. He was gone. He had kept his promise. He had bled every last drop for her, and now she was alone. But Eli didn't die. She did not know how long she lay on his chest, weeping. 10 minutes. An hour. But a sound pulled her back. Hoofbeats. Not a posse. A single horse, pulling a wagon. She looked up, her face a mask of tears and his blood. She saw a farmer's wagon, driven by a woman in a sunbonnet, coming down the pass. The woman saw the bodies. She saw Lila. She pulled her wagon to a sharp halt. "Dear God in heaven," the woman breathed. Lila stood up. She was a terrifying sight, covered in blood, her eyes wild. "Help me," she said, her voice a croak. "Please, he's alive. He's not dead. Help me." The woman, a mountain settler named Martha, was scared. She saw the dead bounty hunter. She saw the half-dead cowboy. But she saw the desperation in Lila's eyes. "Get him in the wagon," Martha said, her voice firm. "Now." Together, they hauled Eli's limp body into the back of the wagon, onto a pile of feed sacks. Lila climbed in after him, cradling his head in her lap. "He's not dead," she kept whispering, to the woman, to herself, to God. "He's not dead." Martha snapped the reins, and the wagon rattled away, leaving Harlan and his shotgun in the dust. They took him to a small, hardscrabble farm in a high valley. A few cabins huddled together against the wind. Martha and her husband. John carried Eli inside and laid him on their own bed. "He's as good as gone," John said, a grim, bearded man. "That's a gut shot." "He is not," Lila said, her voice fierce. She washed him. She cleaned the wound as best she could. She sat by his bed. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She just held his hand, which was cold as stone. "There's a doctor," Martha said, her voice kind. "A Sawbones. He passes through once a month. He's due maybe tomorrow, if the lad holds on." Lila just nodded and held his hand. The doctor came. He was an old man, smelling of whiskey, his hand stained. He looked at the wound, poked at it, and shook his head. "I can pick the shot out," he said, "but the damage is done. He's bleeding inside. I've seen 100 of these. None of them walk away." "You save him," Lila said, her voice low and dangerous. The doctor, seeing the look in her eyes, just sighed. "I'll do what I can, girl. The rest is up to the Almighty." He worked for an hour. Lila held Eli down as the man cut and probed. When he was done, Eli was stitched up, but he was paler, smaller than before. He was a ghost. "Give him water," the doctor said, washing his hands. "If he wakes, but don't hope too hard." Lila stayed. She worked to earn their keep. She became Martha's shadow. She learned to milk the 2 goats, to churn the butter, to mend the fences. She chopped wood, her hands, which had held a gun and saved a life, growing calloused and strong. She worked from sunup to sundown, pushing her body until it was too exhausted to feel. But at night, she would sit by Eli's bed. He did not wake. He just lay there, breathing, his breath so shallow she had to put her ear to his lips to feel it. And in the dark, when Martha and John were asleep, Lila would weep. She would cry in private, her sobs silent, her tears watering the hard, wooden floor. She wept for the man she had lost, and for the man she was about to. She wept every time the wind howled, because it sounded like the canyon, like his last dying breath. Months passed. The high desert autumn turned to a bitter, cold winter. The farm was isolated, locked in by snow, and Eli lived. He was in a sleep so deep it was almost death, but his heart kept beating. Lila fed him, broth and water, drop by drop, like a baby bird. Then, one day, in the deep of winter, when the world was white and silent, his fever broke. She was sitting by his bed, darning a sock, when his fingers moved. She dropped the sock. "Eli?" His eyelids fluttered. He opened his eyes. He was confused. His eyes were hollow, the eyes of a man who had been somewhere else. He looked at her. "Lila?" he whispered. His voice was a dry leaf. She burst into tears. Her first sound of joy in 4 months. She collapsed, her head on his chest, and just wept. He was too weak to move, but he let his hand rest on her hair. Spring came, the snow melted, and the valley turned a soft, pale green. Eli healed, but he was not the same man. He would never be the same. He walked again, but it was a slow, painful shuffle. The shotgun blast had shattered his hip. He would always have the limp. He was thin, his strong cowboy frame now gaunt and scarred. But his eyes were clear. The ghosts were gone. Lila never left his side. She was his crutch. She helped him walk, helped him sit, helped him eat. Her devotion was a quiet, constant thing, as steady as the mountain they lived on. He was no longer her protector. She was his. They were just 2 people, 2 broken halves that made a whole. On a bright spring morning, the air smelling of wet earth and new pine, Eli was sitting on a bench outside the cabin. His first time in the sun, Lila was hanging laundry, her back to him. "Lila," he said. His voice was stronger now. She turned, a clothespin in her mouth. "Come here." She walked over, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "You need something? You cold?" "No." He looked down at his hands. He had been working on something, in secret, for a week. His fingers were still clumsy, but they were sure. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, simple ring. It was made of braided horsehair, dark strands from Buster's mane, and woven into it was a single, small, tarnished silver bead he had taken from Harlan's coat. Lila's breath caught. She stared at it. "I got nothing," Eli said, his voice quiet, looking at the ring in his hand. "I ain't got a ranch. I ain't even a whole man. I can't protect you. I can't be what I was." He looked up at her, his eyes clear and full of a love so deep it hurt to see. "I have nothing but this life, this one you gave back to me, and I'd give all of it for you. Lila, all of it." Lila looked at his face, at this broken, beautiful man who had crossed a wilderness for her, who had died for her. She took the ring. Her hands were trembling. She gently took his scarred, twisted hands in her own. She kissed his knuckles, his wrists, the palms that had fought for her. "You already did," she whispered. "You already gave it all." They were married a week later, under the open sky, on the edge of the valley. John, the farmer, read from a worn-out Bible. Martha was her witness. Buster, munching on new spring grass, was his. Lila wore a simple dress Martha had helped her make. Eli stood, leaning on a cane, but he stood tall. He slipped the horsehair ring onto her finger. They didn't have gold. They didn't have a house. They didn't have a future. not one that was certain. But they stood there, near the place where he had almost died for the last time, the place where she had dragged him back to life. And as she looked at his face, she finally knew what it meant to be loved without chains. It was not a feeling of being owned. It was a feeling of being finally and completely free. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to connect with all of you. So please, comment with where you're listening from. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts on Lila and Eli's journey.